He calmly and politely took his seat in first class, carrying a uniform bag. But the flight attendant yelled at him, paused, and asked a question she would soon regret. "Are you sure you belong here?" What she didn't know was that his wife owned the whole airline, and she was already on her way before we started the story. Let us know where you're watching from today in the comments, and if you like this kind of story, don't forget to subscribe and click the bell icon so you don't miss the next one. He sat quietly in his first-class seat near the window. The soft sound of the engines filled the cabin, and golden light from the late afternoon sun streamed in through the windows. His name was Azim, and he wasn't wearing his uniform, just a simple white shirt tucked into dark gray pants and a light jacket draped over his shoulders. Above him, in the overhead bin, was his garment bag, which said Police Chief Chicago Metro in big blue letters. But Azim wasn't the type of person who needed people to know who he was. He didn't demand attention, and he didn't carry a sign that said Azim. He spoke with pride, walked with pride, listened carefully, and stayed calm when others didn't. It was a big trip. He was invited to speak at a national law enforcement leadership summit. It was an honor that wasn't given out lightly. He had worked hard for 30 years to earn it. His wife Zarin texted him right before takeoff, "Call me when you land, so proud of you, I love you." That one line made him smile. She always reminded him of what was important, even when the world tried to destroy him. To forget about it as other people got on, Azim stayed quiet, didn't look at his phone or read a book. He just sat there with his thoughts calm and steady. But then a voice cut through the silence. "Excuse me, sir." It was the flight attendant, Eliza, and she stood tall with perfect posture, red lipstick that didn't move, and a stare that seemed to look through people instead of at them. "Are you sure you're supposed to be in this seat, Azim?" Eliza didn't move. She looked at the tickets still on his armrest tray and then back at him, her eyes slightly narrowing. "This is a first-class seat," she said again, this time just loud enough for the row behind him to hear. "I know," he replied simply. "That's what I bought." Her smile shrank a little. "Can I see your boarding pass, please?" she asked. Without saying a word, he reached into his coat and handed it to her. She looked at it for longer than necessary, her fingers pressed against it. The edges as if she was looking for something wrong, but the pass was clear and showed that the seat was in first class, seat 1C. Eliza gave it back, but her tone didn't change. "Are you traveling on duty or with someone?" "This seat is for full-fare passengers only," she asked. Azim slowly replied, "I'm not escorting anyone, I'm flying alone." Eliza blinked, clearly unsure of what to say next, gave a short nod, and walked off toward the galley without saying anything else. Azim leaned back in his seat again as the luggage cart rolled by. Inside, he could feel the shift. In energy, a man across the aisle looked at him and quickly turned away. A woman in the next row whispered something to her husband, who replied without looking up. From behind him, a soft voice whispered, "Why did she only ask you?" He picked up his phone again and typed, "Don't worry, I'm fine." He then sent the message to Zarin and put it down. He wasn't really fine, but he had learned how to deal with his feelings without letting them show. What none of them knew was that this wasn't going to be a normal flight, and for Eliza, it was going to be the most memorable flight of her life. When she got back to the galley, she gripped the edge of the counter a little tighter than usual. Her face stayed calm, but her mind was racing. She had worked this route for years, and she knew how things were supposed to go. First class was for a certain type of passenger, the quiet ones in suits, the women with designer bags, and the men with gold watches and soft voices. But Azim seemed off. He seemed so still, or maybe it was the calmness in his voice, or maybe it was just the name on the bag, Police Chief. She didn't know why that bothered her, but it did. From the other side of the galley, another flight attendant walked in. Her name was Mina, and she was younger and new to the airline. She had been quietly watching the whole thing and asked, "Is there a problem with the man in 1C?" Eliza shrugged and poured herself a quick glass of water. Eliza quickly replied, "That doesn't always mean it's valid. I've seen people get upgrades through someone they know at the counter. It happens a lot." Mina didn't answer, saying that she had seen his boarding pass too, from a distance, and there was nothing strange about it. She knew better than to argue, though, because Eliza didn't like being questioned. Back in the cabin, Azim closed his eyes for a moment. He wasn't tired, but he needed to breathe, not because of what Eliza had said, but because of what they meant. This wasn't the first time someone had asked him if he belonged. It happened in restaurants, hotel lobbies, and even board meetings until someone found out what his job was. But on planes, it felt worse. There was nowhere to go, no door to close, just rows of seats and the judgment that came with them. A few rows back, a young man named Belal wearing a navy sweater and jeans asked his sister Huda, "Did you see how she treated that guy in 1C?" Huda nodded, "Yeah, that." Ball looked down the aisle again, but she didn't ask anyone else any questions. At that moment, Mina came out of the galley and started the safety walkthrough. She went by Azim's row and gave him a soft nod. He nodded back, and she hesitated for half a second before moving on. Eliza watched from the doorway of the galley, arms crossed, eyes still fixed on Azim. She didn't like being the second guest, and now she felt like everyone was looking at her, including herself. The plane rolled onto the runway. Far below, in a quiet office with tall glass windows, Zarin stared at her phone screen and read Aim's message again. Her lips were pressed into a thin line as she read it, "Don't worry, I'm fine." She wasn't fine either, but unlike Leah, she knew exactly who she was, and Eliza was about to find out. The seatbelt sign went off with a soft chime as the plane leveled off in the sky. People started adjusting their seats, flipping open magazines, and reaching for their drinks in first class. Even though Azim's hands were folded neatly, his mind wasn't at ease. He could feel how people looked at him, not with open hatred but with that feeling of unease that comes with being seen. He walked down the aisle with a tray offering drinks to first-class passengers. She moved with her usual sharpness, her smile mechanical. When she got to her target, she paused for a second too long and asked, "Can I offer you something to drink, sir?" Her tone was flat. He looked at her. Eliza froze for a moment. "I must have missed it. I was taking care of some seating issues when I noticed," he said simply. She cleared her throat and looked away. "We have juice, water, sparkling water, tea, or coffee." "Just water," Azim said quietly. She poured it and put it in front of him without making eye contact, then she went to the galley, where Mina stood with her arms crossed. When Eliza came back, Mina asked in a careful voice, "Do you think you may be?" Mina raised an eyebrow and asked, "Did you check the system? What was his boarding pass? Did you scan it and check the manifest? You just asked him questions?" Eliza didn't answer right away, her face tightened. "I didn't need to. I've been doing this job for 12 years, I can tell when someone isn't where they're supposed to be." Mina blinked, "Or maybe you just thought he wasn't there." Eliza narrowed her eyes and said, "I don't need advice from someone who's..." Even though Mina didn't argue, she just stepped back and went back to her work, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Eliza had done something wrong back in seat 1C. Azim took a small sip of water and looked at his phone again. Another message had come in, "Zarin, what exactly happened? Tell me everything," he typed slowly and steadily. "She asked me if I was accompanying someone, acted like I didn't belong, and was loud enough for others to hear. I showed her my ID. After a few seconds, the reply came, "Zarin, what's the flight number?" Azim's eyes stayed on the screen. He knew that tone of voice, even through text. He could hear it clearly, calm, director-focused. He gave her the flight number and put the phone down again. The clouds moved, and so did the air inside the cabin. Azim could feel something building, but it wasn't anger, it was calm, steady control. Zarin wasn't going to let this go, and Eliza had just opened a door. Zarin got up from her desk with her phone still in her hand and her eyes fixed on the screen. The sunlight coming in through her office window felt harsh. On the shelf behind her, awards and framed articles showed off her success as CEO of the same airline where her husband was now sitting and being questioned like a stranger. Her name was known throughout the industry because she had built the company from scratch after taking over 6 years ago, but that didn't matter if the people who worked for her couldn't see dignity when it was. Man, her assistant, looked up as soon as she walked into his office. "I need to speak with operations," she said, leaving no time for doubt. "Yes, ma'am, something is wrong with Flight 267 first-class cabin. There's been an incident," she said, her voice sharper. "Get me a direct line to the captain and connect the onboard supervisor to the control office immediately." Man didn't ask for anything else. He picked up the phone and got to work back on the plane. Eliza moved through the cabin again, using her gestures. Although she tried not to look at Aim, she could feel his presence with every step. Something about the way he had spoken earlier made her feel exposed, and she didn't like that other passengers who had seen the earlier interaction kept sneaking looks at Aim, some with sympathy and some with quiet guilt, but no one said a word. One man in 1A, a regular first-class flyer named Tariq, leaned toward Aim and whispered, "I saw what happened earlier that wasn't appropriate." Azim looked at him, gave him a small nod, but didn't say anything. He had long learned that saying sorry after the fact didn't change the fact that they didn't say anything in the first place. At the front of the plane, the captain saw a message flashing on his screen. It was covered, but he knew right away that it said executive override. Only one person in the company had that power. He picked up the internal line and said, "This is Captain Near." A calm voice on the other end answered, "Captain, this is Control. Azim Khan is the passenger. He is the police chief of the Chicago Metro." Captain Near stiffened as he understood what was being said. "More importantly, he is the husband of our CEO Azim Khan, who has given direct orders that flight attendant Eliza will report to the cockpit." The call ended, and Nasir didn't hesitate. He pressed the announcement button and spoke over the intercom, telling Eliza to report to the cockpit right away. Eliza stopped in her tracks, and passengers looked up, some interested and some surprised. Mina's eyes grew wide. She had only heard of cockpit calls like this during emergencies or investigations. Eliza gave the tray to another attendant and made her way to the front. As she walked, Azim's steps became heavier. He didn't move or react, but something inside him told him that Zarin had just stepped in and that the flight was about to change altitude for everyone. Eliza walked into the cockpit with a nervous smile, trying to keep her voice light. "Captain, you wanted to see me," she said. "Captain Near." Near didn't return the smile. He looked serious, his hands still. The first officer looked at her once and then looked straight ahead. The small screen next to the captain lit up again, and it showed the face of Jamal, the head of flight services, who was sitting stiffly in his office chair. His jaw was clenched, and Eliza couldn't read his eyes. He said in a firm voice, "We've received a call from the executive office. There's been a complaint from a first-class passenger, Mr. AMKH." Her face twitched. "Yes, I had to confirm." He cut her off by asking, "Did you scan his boarding pass?" Eliza hesitated. "No, but I checked it." "Did you cross-check it with the manifest before questioning him in front of other people?" he asked sharper. "Then you made a judgment without following procedure." She shifted her weight suddenly, feeling small in the small space. "I didn't know who he was." "You didn't need to," Jamal replied, "but since you brought it up, do you know?" Eliza blinked. "He's a police chief." "Yes, but more importantly, he's the husband of Zarin Khan, our CEO, the captain said in a quiet voice. "The order is clear. You are to return to Mr. Khan right away, apologize to him in front of the cabin, and escort him back with full service for the rest of the flight." Eliza's face turned pale in front of everyone. "Yes," Jamal said flatly. "Once the plane lands, you'll report to the operations office, where a formal review will begin right away." For the first time in years, Eliza had nothing to say. Her voice was stuck in her throat, and she gave a slow nod. The captain ended the call and turned back to his instruments. "Fix it, Eliza, and do it right," he said. As she stepped out of the cockpit, her heart was beating so fast that she could barely hear the engines hum. The passengers were quieter now, Some had caught parts of the announcement, while others could tell that something had changed. As she walked down the aisle, she could feel their eyes on her. Azim looked up as she approached him, but he didn't smile or blink, he just waited. "Mr. KH," Eliza said, forcing her voice to sound polite. "There's been a misunderstanding. I'd like to personally apologize and escort you back to your seat," he said calmly. "There was a misunderstanding. You questioned me, threw away my boarding pass, and embarrassed me in front of the cabin, all without checking your system." "What part of that was unclear?" Eliza's throat tightened as she said, "You're right, I made a mistake. I apologize." As I.M. looked around, other passengers had become quiet again, watching and listening. "You didn't question anyone else," she whispered. "I was wrong about you," he said as he stood up and slowly picked up his bag from under the seat. As he did this, the aisle got narrower and the walk back to first class got longer than it had been before. As he went by, people split up. Some looked away in shame, while others nodded slightly as if they were trying to show support now that they felt safe. But Azim didn't look at them, he just walked, and Eliza followed behind him, her hands shaking because she had lost control, and she had no idea how far this was going to go. Azim went back to seat 1C with. He sat down and put his bag back under the seat. He then adjusted his jacket and didn't say a word as Eliza hovered nearby, not sure what to say next. She wasn't as sure of herself as usual. The polished smile she wore when she got on had disappeared, replaced by a stiff expression and eyes that darted from passenger to passenger, trying to avoid the weight of their stares. He looked up at her, his voice still low but firm. "If you're going to apologize, do it the right way." She opened her mouth. She swallowed once and then spoke in a thin, dry voice, "Mr. KH, I'm sorry for how I treated you earlier. I made an assumption based on limited information, which was wrong. I was rude and embarrassed you in public. I'm sorry it wasn't loud enough for the front rows to hear." A woman in 1D turned her head, and a man across the aisle put down his newspaper. The mood in the cabin had changed completely, and Eliza felt it pressing in on her from every direction. AIM didn't respond right away. The man leaned back, took a magazine out of the seat pocket in front of him, and opened it without even looking at Eliza. She stood there awkwardly, hoping for some kind of acknowledgement, but it never came. Instead, after a long silence, he said quietly, "I've faced worse, but that doesn't make this okay." She slowly nodded and turned to leave, but his voice stopped her again. "Before you go," he said, still not looking at her, "tell me why you questioned me and no one else in this cabin." Eliza turned around, her mouth split. He finally met her eyes and said, "You just don't want to say it." She looked down and said, "I misjudged you." This time, it was less of a line and more of a truth. He gave her a small nod and looked out the window again. She stood there for another second before walking away, her shoes clicking softly on the floor. She didn't go back to the galley right away. Instead, she went into the bathroom, locked the door behind her, and leaned against the mirror, her hands shaking. She knew that people were still looking at her because she could feel it. The whispering hadn't stopped, and Mina's expression earlier, quiet but pointed, was burned into her mind. In the galley, Mina continued to serve on her own, her movements smooth but silent. She didn't talk to Eliza when she finally came back because she didn't need to. Everything that needed to be said had already happened. Meanwhile, Azim sat with his hands crossed in the cabin. He was sitting on the armrests and wasn't angry, at least not in the way that most people thought he would be. He had dealt with this kind of thing all his life, being questioned, stared at, and treated like a second-class citizen, but he never thought it would happen here, not when he was flying on the airline that his wife had worked so hard to build. His phone rang again. It was a message from Zarin. She apologized, but he said, "Stay put and let me handle the rest." Next, he knew Zarin would take care of it, not because he was her husband, but because this wasn't just about him, it was about everyone who had ever been treated like they didn't belong, even when they did. Eliza kept herself busy with small tasks like wiping down clean tray tables, straightening napkins that hadn't moved, and organizing things that didn't need to be organized. She avoided looking at the first-class cabin by walking slowly past Z's row, but she never stopped. There was an invisible line between her and the cabin. Now it was just her and him, and she could feel it burning through the aisle. The mood had changed. It wasn't loud, but it was heavy. There was a silence that made people clear their throats or pretend to scroll through their phones. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was one that made people look at Aim and then quickly turn away, as if they were afraid he would notice. Others stared longer, knowing they had seen something they didn't have the courage to stop when it happened in 1A. He whispered to the man next to him, "Did you see how she walked back from the cockpit? I think she got called out." The man nodded. She should have been, which was embarrassing. Back in the galley, Mina carefully poured a glass of sparkling water and put it on a tray. She then silently made her way to Aim's seat and placed the glass on his table, "Sir," saying softly, "sparkling water on the house." He looked up and gave her a faint nod. "Thank you, Mina," and she blinked in surprise that he knew her name. He smiled. "Let me know if you need anything." She paused because it was wrong, and he nodded again, this time with a little more weight. "You're young. You'll go far if you keep noticing what others try to ignore." She didn't know how to respond, so she just gave him a respectful nod and walked down the aisle. Azim took a sip of the sparkling water. The bubbles were sharp on his tongue. He wasn't thirsty, but he wanted to do something. His thoughts were starting to spiral, not with anger, but with boredom. He thought back to the time a hotel manager asked him to wait in the lobby while other guests were helped. He also remembered the time a department head told him, "You speak very well for someone from your background." He remembered how, every time he earned something, someone tried to take it away from him, not directly, but in little ways that hurt his pride. But today was different. There were witnesses, there was punishment. At that moment, the captain's voice came through the speaker. "We're currently cruising at 36,000 feet, and we'll start descending in about 45 minutes. Please feel free to relax and enjoy the rest of the flight." Eliza, who was standing at the galley counter, gripped the edge with both hands. Her breath was shaking. The call from the cockpit had been bad enough, but it wasn't over yet. She hadn't forgotten Jamal's last words over the cockpit line, "You'll report to operations when the plane lands and you'll face the executive board." She wasn't sure what they would say, but she had a feeling it wouldn't be a gentle warning or a quiet talk. She had shamed someone in power based on a quick glance, a snap judgment, and a bias she had never admitted to herself until now. Behind her, Mina wiped her hands and walked back into the galley. Eliza spoke up out of the blue, "You think I'm done, don't you?" Mina didn't answer right away. She leaned against the panel next to the coffee machine and looked tired. I think she finally told him, "You're lucky he didn't say more." Eliza turned to face Mina and said, "You think I'm racist?" Mina raised her eyebrows and said, "I think you saw a black man sitting in first class and you didn't ask yourself anything else." Eliza's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue because she couldn't. There was silence for a few seconds before Mina said, "You should start thinking about what you're going to say when you land, because I don't think this will go away with a half apology." Eliza didn't answer because she couldn't. She grabbed a paper towel, wiped her already clean hands, and walked out of the galley in seat 1C. Azim looked at his phone again. Another message from Zarenwek said to be waiting at the gate and not to get up when the plane landed. He smiled slightly, not because he liked it, but because he trusted her. She had made her name in places where no one gave her permission. She had built a company so that people like her husband could fly without problems, and now someone had broken that. Zareen wasn't the type to let that happen. As time went on, the plane's silence became thicker, more uncomfortable, and stretched out, as if time were moving more slowly. Most of the passengers stopped acting like they weren't paying attention. Even those who were deep in their screens or books would occasionally look toward the front to see Eliza, who had gone quiet in the galley. Every once in a while, a small, sharp whisper cut through the silence. "She really did that to him. Do you think she'll be fired?" Ollie heard them. He wasn't trying to, but he'd been in enough rooms and walked through enough doorways to know when a crowd was shifting from curiosity to guilt. He was sitting comfortably in his seat with his back straight and his hands folded. He had finished his water and hadn't asked for anything else. He didn't need a drink or a meal. What he needed was already moving toward him like a train on the runway. A man across the aisle leaned slightly toward him. His name was Naveed, and he was in his mid-50s and wore an expensive suit. He was a frequent business traveler. "If it's okay with you, sir, I saw what happened earlier and it was unfortunate." Nate cleared his throat and said, "Yes, well, I mean clearly a mistake on our part." Azim looked at him for a moment and then asked calmly, "Did you think it was a mistake when she questioned me or only after you realized who I was?" Naveed opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. His fingers tapped the edge of his seat, and his smile quickly faded. "That's what I thought," Azim said, turning back to. Naveed leaned back in his seat and his face turned a little red. A few rows behind him, a young woman named Farah, who had been quiet the whole flight, quickly typed something on her phone and posted a short update on social media about how a flight attendant made fun of a man for sitting in first class. It turns out that he's the police chief and his wife owns the airline. The post started going viral almost right away in the cockpit. Captain Neer got another direct message from Ground Control CEO. Arrival confirmed. Vehicle standing by at gate. Security escort authorized. Prepare. Passenger Azim Khan for direct disembark. He sighed, adjusted his headset, and told the crew Eliza what he had heard. CEO will be meeting the flight upon arrival. You are to remain on board after all passengers have disembarked. Security will escort you directly to operations, he said. Eliza was standing by the beverage cart, her hands still. Mina looked over her, her eyes narrowing as she remembered what she had heard. Eliza slowly turned around and asked, "Are you really coming here?" The captain replied, "Yes," and she asked that Mr. Khan stay seated after landing. Eliza's throat felt tight. Was she going to talk to me? There was a pause, then I don't know, but she'll definitely talk to someone. Eliza didn't answer. She stood there for a few seconds before slowly making her way to the front of the cabin. She walked past Aim without saying a word. He didn't look at her. Her steps felt heavy, like they. Imbal leaned over to his sister Huda and whispered, "She's done, isn't she?" Huda didn't look up from her phone, even though she should have. Belal nodded, but she wouldn't properly apologize. People like her never do. At that very moment, Azim's phone buzzed again. "Zaren's plane lands in 20 minutes. Don't talk to anyone else. I'll handle it from here." He smiled weakly. There was no anger in him now. There was only stillness and confidence because he knew that this time it wouldn't be brushed aside, not in a report or a quiet HR. The silence had turned into attention, and the woman who had been humiliated wasn't on this flight, but she owned every bit of it, and she was almost there. The plane started its slow descent, and the seatbelt sign lit up with a soft chime. Passengers moved in their seats, fastened their belts, closed their tray tables, and straightened their backs, but there wasn't the usual pre-landing chatter. The air inside the cabin felt tight, like the whole flight was holding its breath. His body was still and his mind was calm. He wasn't nervous or even angry anymore. He had been through enough to know that dignity didn't need to scream to be heard. It just needed to be protected. Today, Zaren was protecting him, and when she tried to move, she never did it halfway. He looked down at his phone and saw that she had sent him one more message. "We'll meet the aircraft. Do not speak until I arrive." He slowly smiled and put the phone in his coat pocket. And looked ahead. The clouds were breaking up, and city lights started to shine below them. Everything that had been quietly building up in the sky was about to hit solid ground, and it would hit harder than any turbulence in the galley. Eliza gripped the back counter with sweaty hands. Her eyes darted up and down the aisle, first to Aziz's row and then back down again. Her thoughts were going in circles. What had begun as a casual check and an assumption had turned into a nightmare that she kept trying to convince herself of. Too many eyes had shown her the truth. She hadn't questioned anyone else but him, and it wasn't because of the rules, but because of what she thought she saw. Mina moved next to her and checked the landing gear without saying a word. The silence between them was no longer caused by tension, but by clarity. Mina didn't need to say anything. Eliza already knew where she stood. "Are they really coming?" Eliza asked in a voice barely above a whisper. Mina nodded once. Azim Khan had only been seen on magazine covers, press videos, and framed photos in the training center. She was one of the few leaders that people actually listened to, not because she yelled, but because once she made a decision, no one could change it. In the cockpit, Captain Near finished his landing briefing and tapped into the cabin announcement system. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Chicago," it said. "Please stay where you are until the..." The last sentence wasn't normal. It made people look at him differently. A woman in seat 2D blinked and asked, "Did he just say security?" Huda whispered to Ball, "They're not wasting time." As the plane slowed down on the runway, the wheels touched down, and the sign for seatbelts was turned off for some passengers. Azim felt the change in the way people looked at him, too. People who had ignored him at the beginning of the flight were now watched him with a mix of discomfort and interest. The man in Naveed had become quiet, and even he seemed unsure of how to act now that the mask was off. Azim adjusted his cuff, sat back in his seat, and closed his eyes for a moment. Outside, the plane pulled up to a private gate, where a black SUV with tinted windows was waiting. Behind them, 2 security officers in dark uniforms stood with their eyes alert, and a woman in a tailored navy coat stood calmly with her arms crossed. Her scarf blew a little in the wind, but her stance was firm. Zerine didn't say anything and didn't rush. She just waited until the gate was closed and the door unlocked from the inside. Eliza stood frozen near the front galley, her body tense and her lips pressed together. She could hear the murmurs getting louder, with people sitting up straighter and looking toward the door, wondering what was going to happen next. The seatbelt sign went off with a chime, which usually causes chaos with people jumping up and grabbing their bags and squeezing for the aisle, but no one moved in first class. Captain Near got out of the cockpit and walked straight to Azim's seat. "Mr. Khan," he said, "please remain seated. Security will be with you in a moment." Azim gave a simple nod to show that he understood. Then the door opened, and Zarin stepped on board. She didn't smile or raise her voice, she just stood there, taking it all in with sharp eyes. She looked at the faces in first class, spotted Azim right away, gave him a subtle nod, and then she looked at Eliza and... Eliza's throat tightened as she thought about everything that had happened 35,000 feet in the air. The plane had just landed, and Zarin was about to bring the rest of the weight down. Zarin stood in the doorway of the plane, her posture straight and her expression unreadable. Her presence alone seemed to silence the hum of the engines, and the people in the front seats leaned slightly to the side to catch her face. Their curiosity had turned into awe. This wasn't just the CEO of the airline, this was the woman they had been hearing about during the flight, whose husband had been humiliated just hours before. Eliza stood still on the floor, unable to speak. Her mouth was dry, and she was desperately searching her mind for an excuse, an explanation, a reason, but there was none. Zarin's eyes locked on hers. They weren't angry, but they were sharp enough to cut through everything Eliza had been thinking. Zarin walked slowly into the cabin, each step deliberate, calm, and almost quiet, but each one felt louder than the last. Didn't stop until she was standing right in front of Azim's seat. He looked up at her with a faint smile that didn't mean he was bragging, just familiarity. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, the first time she had been soft since getting on the plane. "I'm fine," he replied. "Thank you," she replied. "My name is Azim Khan, and I am the CEO of this airline. A few hours ago, my husband, Police Chief Azim Khan, was questioned in front of you all by a senior crew member. Someone looked at him and decided he didn't belong on the plane." The cabin was silent, and she continued, "Let me be clear, this airline has rules, procedures, and training. We don't teach judgment based on appearance, and we don't tolerate it when it happens." She turned to Eliza, whose face had lost all color. "You embarrassed a decorated officer, a man who has spent decades protecting people, including people like you, and you didn't even bother to check the system before." Eliza tried to speak, "Ma'am, but Zarin raised his hand to stop her from embarrassing herself even more. "Save it for the board," he told her. The air felt tight again, tighter than it had been the whole flight. The quiet inside the cabin wasn't just silence, it was realization that people were now facing their own inaction, the whispers, the side glances, the choice to stay quiet when someone was being questioned without a reason. Now that the whole story had come out, many couldn't. As two uniformed security officers walked onto the plane, they approached Eliza without saying a word. One stood next to her, and the other stood just behind her. "Come with us," one of them said. Eliza nodded faintly, her body stiff. She looked at Zarin once, hoping for some kind of last-minute leniency, but Zarin's face didn't change, it was fixed, like a judge who had already heard enough. As Eliza was led off the plane, some passengers watched with guilt, while others were quiet. A few people turned away, not sure what to think about what they had just seen. The woman who had strutted through the cabin hours earlier now looked like a ghost of herself, with her small steps, hunched shoulders, and eyes fixed on the floor. Zarin turned back to Azim and lowered her voice again. "They've scheduled a full review," she said. "She suspended effective immediately." Azim nodded. "That's fair." She put a gentle hand on his shoulder and said, "You handled it with more control than I could have." He smiled softly. It wasn't the first time she. Zarin sighed and said, "That's the problem." Mina approached him quietly and stood at a respectful distance. He noticed her and gave her a single nod. "You're the only crew member who acted with any sense," he said. "I just did what I thought was right, and that's exactly why I want to talk to you after we disembark." Mina's eyes widened, and she gave him a slight bow of the head. Zarin looked back at Aim. "There's a car waiting outside." "Let's go," he said. Looking again down the aisle, the same aisle he had walked alone and silently judged, felt different this time. As he went past the rows of seats, people didn't avoid his eyes, instead, they held them out of respect. No one would forget what happened that flight, not even he or the woman who ran the skies. Azim and Zarin got off the plane and into the private gate corridor, accompanied by security and closely followed by Mina, who had been asked to do so. As the heavy door behind them shut, it felt like the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The whispers, the stares, and the weight of silent guilt were all left behind on the plane, but for those who had seen the humiliation and said nothing, the memory would linger on the tarmac. The cool evening air brushed against Z's face, and at the bottom of the stairs, a sleek black car with its doors open and its driver standing ready. There were no reporters or flashing cameras, just silence. As they walked toward the car, Zarin slightly turned her attention to Mina and said, "When we get back to headquarters, I want your full report from the beginning on everything you saw, what was said, and how you responded." Mina quickly nodded. "Of course, ma'am." Zarin gave a faint nod. "You weren't in charge today, but you showed more leadership than the person who was." Mina didn't know how to respond because praise from a woman like Zarin wasn't something she took lightly. It wasn't given away for free, you had to work for it, and today Mina had. As Aim got into the car, Zarin stood by the door for a moment and looked over at the plane behind them. Eliza was still on board, being questioned by two senior operations managers. She had been told to stay on the plane until she was cleared to leave, but Zarin had already made up her mind. The process would be formal, but the outcome was clear. She sat down in the back seat. Aziz sat down next to Zarin and closed the door. The car was warm, quiet, and dimly lit, a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere of the flight. Zarin looked at him and said, "I'll never wear that uniform again." Aziz leaned his head back against the seat and finally let out a breath he'd been holding since takeoff. There was a long, comfortable silence between them. They didn't need to talk, everything they wanted to say had been said through looks. Zarin finally felt confident enough to embarrass you in front of everyone, but Azim replied that she was sure no one would stop her. Serene slowly nodded. "That's what I can't allow, not in my company, not in my name." Azim looked over at her and said, "You changed a lot when you took over, but I didn't change enough." Zarin said firmly, "There are still too many people in positions of authority who act without consequence and too many who watch and say nothing." Azim reached into her bag and She quickly opened a file on her tablet that said, "Immediate action, crew behavior reform. I'm calling for a board meeting tomorrow. Full revision of first-class service policy, mandatory bias training for all in-flight staff, anonymous reporting for passengers and crew, and starting next week I'm handpicking 5 crew leads for a new internal review." Council member Azim looked at her and said, "You're going to do all that because of this?" Serene turned her head toward him, "Not just because of this, because this was seen most of the people like you are usually shamed quietly when no one is looking, but this time everyone was looking and no one said a word. That's what I'm going to change." Azim nodded, his eyes wide. "It's not about her, is it?" Zarin asked. "It never was." The car drove through the private exit gate and out of the airport. Back inside, Eliza sat stiffly in the same seat, still surrounded by 2 members of the Internal Review Board. Her eyes were red, and her voice was quieter. She had stopped arguing and justifying herself, and her answers were short and broken. One of the managers put down the file in front of him and said, "We'll be in touch within 24 hours. Until then, your clearance has been suspended, and you are not permitted to wear your uniform or enter any aircraft." Eliza didn't answer, so they left her there in silence. It was in that silence that she finally realized what she had done. It wasn't a mistake, it was a choice she had made without thinking, and she would carry that choice with her for the rest of her life. Zarin and Azim's car drove off into the city lights, and there were echoes of accountability in the sky where power had once tried to hide behind a smile. For the first time in years, Azim felt something he didn't feel very often anymore: peace. The city skyline rolled past the windows of the black car as it drove smoothly through traffic. Inside, the warm leather seats were comforting, but Azim wasn't resting. His body was relaxed, but his mind was alert. He had thought about what happened on the flight too many times, the tone Eliza had used, the way she had looked at him. The passengers were quiet, and the humiliation that started with "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" started to creep up on him. He had learned a long time ago to stay calm and replace his anger with patience, composure, and control, but even the strongest self-control couldn't take away the pain of being treated like an intruder in a place where you belonged. Zarin was sitting next to him, working quietly on her tablet. Her fingers moved quickly, and her eyes were fixed on the screen. This wasn't anger out of frustration, it was policy and motion action with purpose. Zarin's leadership had never been about making noise, it had always been about following through. Now she was building something that Eliza would never see, but that others would benefit from for years to come. "Azim, you're already writing new policy?" she asked, quietly looking over what she had already done. "It goes into effect by Friday for every crew member on every route. No more surface-level training, and no more empty apologies." She looked at him with softening eyes and said, "I'm not just doing this because you're my husband. If it can happen to you, someone with a title and experience with calm, it can happen to anyone." He slowly nodded. They don't usually have someone waiting at the gate. As the car pulled into their building's underground garage, security was already there. The door was open for them, and Azim stepped out first, stretching his back slightly. Zarin followed suit. As they rode the elevator in silence, the doors opened to their simple, elegant, and minimalist apartment. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows let in a view of the city below, where people were going about their daily lives, unaware of the storm that had passed above them hours before. Azim put his coat on the rack and walked to the kitchen, where he poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter. "I wonder if she'll ever really understand what she did," he thought. She walked up to him and said, "Maybe not today, but she'll always remember how it felt to be walked off that plane." Azim nodded. "That's a start," but Zarin agreed, "That's not enough." There was a pause. The air between them was thick with shared experience, not just from today but from the years before, the unspoken looks, the assumptions, the rooms where they were treated like help even when they were running the show. "I didn't expect that today," Azim finally said. "Neither did I," Zarin replied. He looked at her and said, "You were ready." "I always am." She said this almost without emotion as she turned and walked to her study. As she stepped in, her phone buzzed again with an internal alert. Someone had posted about the flight on social media, and the story was quickly going viral. Passengers were confirming details and screenshots were showing up. The name of the person had not been released yet, but the story had gone viral within an hour. Zarin stared at the. She looked at her phone screen for a moment and then locked it. She didn't need to fan the flames or for everyone to scream in outrage. Her responsibility wasn't to social media, it was to policy, to truth, to structure, and to everyone who might one day sit in seat 1C only to be told they didn't bell. She sat down at her desk, opened her notes, and started finalizing her speech to the executive board. Tomorrow wouldn't be about Eliza, it would be about culture, accountability, and the unspoken rules people carried around with them. She didn't want. Azim stood in the kitchen and looked out the window at the city lights, which were still shining steadily and quietly. He didn't smile or frown, he just stood there at peace, not because justice had been done fully, but because for once, someone like Eliza hadn't walked away without being punished, and for once, someone else had to sit through the pain, and he had finally been seen. The next morning came quietly, without any drama or headlines. The sky over Chicago was pale and cold, the kind of sky that made the city feel slow and thoughtful. There was silence inside the airline's headquarters, but Zarin showed up early in a charcoal gray coat with a crisp white blouse under it. Her team was already in place, with department heads, board members, HR executives, and others seated around the long glass table in the executive boardroom. No one spoke as she walked in. They had all seen the names in the internal report and knew this meeting wasn't just about one flight or one employee, it was about what their company had silently allowed to happen. She put her leather folder on the table, slowly opened it, and started speaking without making small talk. "This isn't a meeting," she said, "it's a correction." Everyone sat a little straighter. What happened yesterday wasn't just an insult to one man, it was an example of unchecked power, it was a reflection of what happens when training is just a box to check and not a standard to uphold. We sell our service with words like excellence, dignity, and respect, but that doesn't mean anything if the people we trust with our brand don't treat our customers with that kind of respect. No one spoke up or dared to say anything, so I started a formal investigation and the staff member in question was suspended. But this won't end there. We will also look at every complaint from the last 18 months, including every small misunderstanding and every guest conflict that was quietly marked as resolved. Because buried in those reports are the names of people who were treated like they didn't belong, and most of them were women. Senior board member Iron cleared his throat and said, "Respect, Zarin. What happened was unacceptable. But this incident is already spreading online. Should we prepare a statement before it escalates?" Zarin didn't look up from her folder. "We're not chasing headlines," she said. "We're fixing what caused them." As soon as we released a PR statement, this became a press issue, but it wasn't, it was a values issue, and we would deal with it internally first with real. She closed the folder and finally looked up. "Here's what's happening. All crew leaders will immediately undergo retraining, not by consultants but by people who know what it's like to be watched, doubted, and judged, people who've lived it, not just studied it." She kept her tone razor sharp. "We're also introducing a protocol for on-flight conflict that allows any staff member, not just senior crew, to raise silent alerts to management if they witness discrimination, and those alerts will go through." Several board members looked at each other, and Zarin added in a calm but firm voice, "Starting today, any flight attendant with more than 3 flagged interactions, resolved or not, will face immediate review because patterns don't lie and this company will no longer pretend they're not there." The room went silent again, but this time it wasn't because people didn't agree, but because they slowly realized that something permanent had just been started. Zarin leaned back in her chair, and her face changed. "We've built a successful brand," she said. "Now we need to build a good one. This company doesn't belong to shareholders or VIPs, it belongs to everyone who boards a flight expecting to be treated like a person." Iron slowly nodded and murmured, "Understood." Zarin said, "Let's start." As the boardroom filled with quiet conversation and shuffling papers, Zarin's eyes stayed still. She wasn't thinking about Eliza or even Azim, she was thinking about the hundreds of passengers who had probably left. People who had been on planes over the years and felt small, unseen, or disrespected because someone in uniform decided they didn't belong never got a meeting, but today they did. Across the city, Azim stood in front of a classroom full of new police officers. He had been scheduled to speak weeks earlier, long before the flight, on the topic of leadership under pressure. He didn't talk about the plane or Eliza, but when he talked about how important it is to stay calm when someone questions your worth, the room went crazy. At that moment, he wasn't just a police chief, he was living proof that dignity didn't have to speak out to be heard, it only had to stand its ground. By late afternoon, word had quietly spread through the airline's internal networks. Everyone on staff, from senior flight leads to gate agents, had received a formal message requiring them to attend scheduled policy review sessions. It didn't take long for people to figure out what the message meant. It wasn't a friendly memo, it was more direct and less polished. There was a sign that something had changed at the top, and this wasn't going to go away like every other incident that had been dealt with in silence. In the break rooms at the terminals, people whispered, and some defended Eliza by saying she was just doing her job. Others said nothing, but their silence wasn't agreement, it was recognition that they had seen things too. Maybe they had looked the other way, or maybe they hadn't done anything, but now they were thinking twice. It was Mina who sat alone at the training center, scrolling. There were a lot of messages on her phone from coworkers she hadn't talked to in months. They said things like, "Okay, heard what happened, respect for how you handled it, you're probably going to get promoted after this," but none of them made her feel better. Mina wasn't thinking about rewards or praise, she was still thinking about the time she watched Azim sit quietly while a room full of strangers questioned him like he had snuck onto the flight, and how easy it would have been for her to look away. The door opened, and Zarin walked in. Mina quickly stood up. "Ma'am." Zarin raised a hand, gently. "Relax, sit," and Mina nodded. She then sat back down, her hands folded nervously in her lap. Zarin pulled out a chair across from her, lowered herself slowly, and met her eyes. "I read your statement, I read it twice, I tried to be honest," she said. "You acted in real time, you didn't wait for permission, you saw something wrong and didn't hide behind rank." Mina didn't know what to say. Zarin continued, "Do you know how rare that is in this industry? People follow the chain of command and protocol, but they rarely follow principle. That's what stood out to me." Mina's throat felt tight, it didn't feel right how she treated him, he didn't even raise his voice. Zarin nodded slowly, "He never does." For a moment, the room was still. Zarin leaned forward slightly and said, "You're being reassigned." Mina's eyes widened, and her heart skipped a beat. "Ma'am, you're not fired," Serene added quickly, "you're being promoted." Mina blinked. "That you will be shadowing my office for the next 3 months as the flight operations lead assistant. I want you to help oversee the new crew reform program." Mina stared at her, unable to speak. "I don't need someone with years of experience, I need someone who knows what right looks like and what wrong feels like when no one else wants to name it." Mina finally found her voice to say, "Thank you, I don't know what to say." Zarin smiled gently, the first real warmth on her face all day. "Say yes," Mina said quickly, almost out of breath. "Yes," Zarin stood nodded again. "Like you should be helping to decide how people are treated up there, not just following the rules but making new ones." She walked to the door but stopped just before opening it. "Oh, and Mina, yes, you didn't just help my husband. You reminded this company of who we're supposed to be." And with that, she left. Mina sat in the empty room for a moment longer, stunned. Her heart pounded not from fear this time, but from something else, maybe pride or relief, across the city. Azim looked him in the eyes and told him, "When you know who you are, no one else gets to decide." A few of the young cadets had stopped him at the door and asked him quietly about his speech. One had asked, "Sir, how do you stay calm when people test you like that?" As he stepped out into the cool evening air, he thought back to the flight. Not the humiliation, but the silence and looks. He thought about how justice hadn't come in a loud moment, but in 1,000 quiet ones: Zaren's steady steps, Mina's quiet nod, the passengers who turned their heads, and those who. Afterwards, he dropped them, and as he walked through the parking lot to his car, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Zaren: "She's been let go. It's official." He smiled to himself as he put the phone in his pocket, realizing that silence hadn't protected the powerful for once. For once, the quiet man had the last word. As night fell over the city like a soft curtain, ending the day, but for Az and Zaren, it was the end of something much bigger than a day. At home, the lights were dimmed, the air was calm, and the thick glass windows blocked out the noise of the outside world, emails, and the growing online storm. In the living room, Azim sat on the edge of the couch with a book on his lap, but he had forgotten about it. His eyes were fixed on the quiet skyline outside, where buildings sparkled like pieces of stories that didn't need to be told out loud. Zaren came in from her office, holding her tablet in one hand. At first, she didn't say anything. She just stood there and watched her husband, letting the silence settle. He turned slightly and asked, "You didn't come to bed last night?" She smiled faintly, and he replied, "Neither did I." She walked over and sat down next to him. "I've had worse," she said, "but this one felt different because it was personal." Serene looked up at the skyline for a moment. "It shouldn't have to be personal for us to care this much. But maybe change will happen when the right people get tired of being quiet." Azim leaned back and stretched his arms slightly. "You handled it like you always do, quietly, without fire but with precision," she said with a soft laugh. "You know what's funny? When I first joined this company, they told me to stay behind the scenes. CEOs shouldn't get involved in day-to-day drama. I should let middle management handle employee discipline," she said. Azim raised an eyebrow. "You ever listened to that advice only once?" she asked. "I regretted it for a moment." He turned to look at her directly and said, "You didn't just protect me, Zaren. You protected everyone like me who's ever been asked, 'Are you sure you belong here?'" Zaren nodded slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "No one gets to ask that question anymore, not on my planes." For a few minutes, they just sat there together, listening to the sounds of the city far below. In the silence, the weight of the last 24 hours began to lift, not all at once, but in slow pieces. The phone rang on the table, and he picked it up and stared at the screen. A news story had just come out called "Airline CEO Takes Swift Action After In-Flight Incident, Employee Fired, New Reform Program Announced." Below the headline were photos of Zaren giving a speech in a conference room, Mina standing next to a press board, and a third photo taken secretly by a passenger on the flight of AIM sitting in seat 1C. Zaren leaned over to look. It was spreading quickly. Did he want it too? He looked at her deeply, noticing the lines on her face, the calm in her eyes, and the steady strength she always carried without armor. "You didn't choose this life for attention," he said. "You chose it for impact, and I got both," she replied, her voice soft but full. Outside, snow was falling, and light flakes drifted past the window, catching the city lights like ash from a fire that had finally burned out inside. Azim reached out and took her hand. Zaren smiled and said, "We keep going, we rebuild, and we teach everyone in this company, from the gate to the cockpit, exactly what respect looks like." Azim nodded once, and she looked him in the eye to remind him. They sat there a little longer, hand in hand, watching the snow. Far away, in 1,000 airports, new passengers were getting on new flights. Most of them wouldn't know what had happened yesterday. They'd walk onto the planes, take their seats, and expect a normal trip, but something was off. Something had changed, rules were being broken, eyes were opening, and a new voice was coming from rooms that had been silent before. It was the voice of people who were no longer willing to be ignored. This wasn't a story about revenge, titles, or power. It was about what happens when dignity meets resistance. Watch this movie and let us know what you think in the comments. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to make sure you don't miss any more powerful stories like this one.